from 1969 to 1973, which was a big period of anti-war activity. I used to drive a Boston cab around both cities, amongst other jobs that I had. I also thank the organizers for inviting two people from New York to be at their New England conference.
Red Sox.
And
Honorary members of the
yeah. And I think you picked a good contrast because Nellie's from the African-American community in New York City, and I'm from upstate New York, where, of course, the stereotype is a white guy with a pickup truck and a gun rack in the back. And I had that kind of a job, actually. I worked for the railroad, for the CSX Railroad. I'm a member of the Machinist Union, past president of my local, and I worked with white guys with pickup trucks. I wanted to talk briefly about contrasting the current period with that of that I experienced back in the late 60s and early 70s here in Boston during the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement. In those days, in the late 60s and early 70s, we had full employment. So the economy really wasn't an issue in relation to the war. I mean, you could literally walk out of one factory if you didn't like it and go into another one and get another job during that period. Manufacturing was still very strong. You could get a factory job easily. Many of my friends did. And you could leave it the next day and go grab another one somewhere. So therefore, there wasn't an economic draft. They had to use a real draft. And that's, of course, a lot of the driving of the anti-war movement during that period was the fact of the real draft that opened the eyes of people like myself to what was going on in the world and what the role of our government's foreign policy was. Today, things are quite different. In this century, we have a permanent, basically, recession or depression for a lot of people, and that has only gotten worse in the last period. Jobs are being outsourced, factories, of course, but also white-collar jobs. You know, the kind of people who never expected to be unemployed or destitute or homeless or whatever are now in that situation. There was just an article about it in the New York Times this morning about, you know, people my age in their early 60s depending on their children to keep a roof over their heads. So now we also have an economic draft, as I'm sure you're familiar with, because of the economic situation, and a lot of these people who are involved in the economic draft to join the military come from places like upstate New York, you know, white guy pickup truck territory, small towns, because of the lack of opportunity in these rural areas. And of course, we also have, as a result of the rebellion against the draft during the Vietnam War, the huge use of mercenary forces, so-called contractors, in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Again, drawn pretty much from the same pool of the white guy pickup truck crowd in rural areas. During the Vietnam War, Vietnam was presented as a domino in the communist conspiracy to take over the world. The fear was ideological, not that, basically that you would be turned into some kind of a zombie. And we all remember, you know, the pod people movies and things like that that played on that fear. Today, Afghanistan and Iraq have been presented an entirely, again, fear is the driver. It's always fear in this country that they use, but it's a physical fear that you might become blown up by a terrorist in an airplane or in the Twin Towers or whatever. They've resorted to a much more primitive fear. You know, the reality is, of course, that very few of us are going to be in a situation where we're going to be blown up in an airplane or an office building, but that's what they're using as a motivation for defense of their policies. That hasn't changed between Obama and Bush. So therefore, given the change in the situation and the discussion we're having around the economic crisis, that in terms of talking to working people, which is what I do on a daily basis on my job in the labor movement, we have to figure out how to bring out the question of the economic crisis so that as a wedge against this fear, because the reality is you're a lot more likely to lose your job and be homeless and suffer some kind of even physical harm as a result of the economy than you are to be blown up by a terrorist somewhere. And we have to get that across to people. We have to cut through the bullshit, about terrorism. And lately in upstate New York, both in my industry, the road industry, where there's been massive layoffs, and in the local economy, which is dominated in the capital region of New York by the state workers who are now in an unfolding economic crisis similar to that of California. And more specifically, a situation that has recently developed, a very interesting situation where a factory just north of Troy, which used to be owned by GE but was spun off to a private equity firm, they unilaterally, during the middle of a contract, slashed the production workers' pay from 25 to 50%. A friend of mine who has worked there for more than 20 years had her pay cut from $29 an hour to $19 an hour. And these are white workers. These are your pickup truck people. And the response has been very interesting. They have suddenly come alive, and it's like Rip Van Winkle waking up and rubbing their eyes. What's going on here? And their president and officers have joined the Troy Labor Council. The resolution, I only have 20 copies, you can please share them, that we passed on a national labor march for jobs, peace, and healthcare justice was very much supported by these people. They had just joined the council last October. And it's really been something to see, a little glimpse of the most conservative group in the working classes, which is the predominantly white male workforce, waking up a little bit. And I think that is something we have to look for. In my experience, it's interesting, this whole question of what Nellie talked about and Glenn talked about, how white leftists take their cue from the black leftists and so on. But in the larger picture, black workers tend to hang back, because I'm in the minority, as I've been told by many of them, and look for initiatives by the white working class. And I think that when you see something like we're seeing right now in upstate New York, that is going to be an interesting dynamic as well, because a black worker who might be only 2 or 3 or 5 in a workplace, as it is often the case in upstate New York, is going to feel a lot more emboldened and empowered if he sees the white workers moving into action.